America, which we think of, but also from Africa, from Korea, from China, in all of those cities. So in those ways, southern cities are much more like the Northeast and the Midwest. But it is also true that there are many signs that, and those, I think, are the good ways in which the South has changed. Those are the impulses that I see as prompting optimism. But there are other signs. And I go back to George Wallace's presidential campaigns, 64, 68, and 72. The Washington Post had a big front page story the other day on George Wallace's 1972 campaign and how it paved the way for Donald Trump. Well, Fry and I beat the Washington Post to that story because I can promise you in 2015, Donald Trump came to Mobile, Alabama, where I was then living. 30,000 or 40,000 people, overwhelmingly white. I would say 98% of them in that stadium were white, as I watched it on television. I wasn't going down there. Were white. And I'm listening to this on TV and listening to Trump's rhetoric, and I'm thinking, George Wallace.
That sounds like George Wallace.
And, you know, all of the rage was there. All of the sense of grievance was there that Wallace preyed on, telling whites that they were the victims, that they had been given a raw deal. And all of the anger and hints of violence, in the same way that Wallace would complain about his media coverage and suggest that, you know, maybe something bad ought to happen to the people who criticized him, including journalists. Trump did exactly the same thing. So that was one of the ways I saw the more malevolent traits of the South spreading out. After all, Trump grew up in Queens. Didn't have a Southern bone in his body, but somehow the Wallace influence is the first thing he picked up. He wasn't the first one, however. The Southern strategy that Republicans used from Richard Nixon onward was picked up from Wallace.
And you talk about that in the book. That's the place in the book where I am most fascinated, because it's the beginning.
It's the beginning,
It's the beginning for the rest of the argument that you and Fry lay out. And of course, I've seen video of Wallace, I've read about Wallace, and just to put a pin on that as the beginning. And I think it's an exciting political story that you tell through these presidential campaigns that then came after Wallace. So could you walk us from Wallace to Nixon to the aberration of Carter and then Reagan and kind of forward?
Certainly. When Wallace ran in 68 and later in 72, particularly in 72 before he got shot, I think Richard Nixon was worried because Wallace was winning primaries outside the South. When he was shot, and this happened in 68 as well, Nixon was picking up tips from Wallace, but Nixon decided he needed to be much more subtle. He didn't say the same things that Wallace said, but he played on the same fears. Nixon talked about law and order. Ronald Reagan came along in 1980 and talked about states' rights. Well, Wallace had used exactly that phrase when he opposed desegregation. When Wallace stood in the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama to try to keep 2 black students from entering that school, he talked about states' rights. Well, when he launched his campaign for the presidency in 1980, Ronald Reagan came to the Neshobe County Fair near Philadelphia, Mississippi. Well, for those of us who have studied the civil rights movement, Philadelphia has a certain meaning. 3 civil rights workers were slaughtered in Philadelphia, Mississippi. Ronald Reagan came there in 1980. He didn't mention the deaths of 3 civil rights workers, but he did talk about states' rights, which again, if you grew up black in Alabama like I did, states' rights had a certain meaning and it wasn't a good thing. However, before that, Jimmy Carter had won in 1976, which we all took as a sign of progress. One of the ways that the South might influence the nation in a good way, because Carter specifically talked about what he had learned as a white Southerner.
Right.
That the South and the nation needed to throw over racial prejudice. Carter lost for reasons that didn't have anything to do with those things, I don't think. But when Reagan came along, Reagan decided that the way to appeal to disaffected whites was through the Southern strategy. Fast forward to George H.W. Bush. He was a little less likely to use that strategy, but his campaign strategist, Lee Atwater, went right for that strategy.
Infamously.
With the Willie Horton ads. Some of you in this room are old enough to remember the Willie Horton ads. So Michael Dukakis obviously made a mistake in terms of how he viewed that particular program of giving furloughs, weekend furloughs to prisoners. Perhaps violent prisoners shouldn't have been included. But that's not what Atwater was saying in the commercials.
Right.
He used Willie Horton's picture over and over and even darkened his features and made him look more menacing. This was saying to white voters, boy, you better be scared of those black criminals if Michael Dukakis is elected.
Exactly.
But he was defeated for re-election, and again a white Southerner won, Bill Clinton, who was a man who understood the damage that racism had done to the South and the nation. He had 2 good terms in which he appointed many black people to high offices. Many people would argue that Clinton's decision to triangulate, if you remember that, to govern as a centrist meant that his tenure wasn't as progressive as it might have been. But overall, if you forget about his personal peccadillos, I think he had 2 good terms. After that, however, we had the misadventure of the 2000 election.
Yes. Oh my goodness. This is actually the first presidential election that I voted in. My parents were very into politics, so I was aware of presidential elections since Bush and first Bush. And this one was my first one to vote in. It's why I'm a cynical radical now, because I had believed, in democracy in a particular kind of way. And it makes me think too of the subtitle of you all's book, which is A Story of Democracy and the Balance. And so for me, I feel like that's a story of my life as a voter, democracy in the balance, sort of watching Jesse Jackson in Florida and hanging chads and all of these things. So when I got to that part of the book, I was thinking, okay, I have these connections between kind of this Southern strategy, this Wallace program, and Bush, who comes from Texas but is not a Texan, and all these kinds of things. Can you talk to us about that as a pivotal moment? Because I feel like that's the middle of this story, 2000.
That is a pivotal moment because that race was decided by the Supreme Court on a 5-4 vote. And many legal scholars have wrote then and since. It was an extremely poorly decided Supreme Court ruling. And even some of the conservatives who voted with it have said, and this shouldn't be taken as precedent. Sandra Day O'Connor, who was one of the 5 conservatives, expressed second thoughts about it later on, after she was off the court. But I think that was a pivotal moment because the Supreme Court stepped in not as a fair arbiter of justice and democracy, but conservatives putting their foot on the scales to decide that election for Bush. I remember the Bush presidency for a couple of things. A man that many people voted for because they thought he was a nice guy, that they would feel comfortable having a beer with.
That's how they make job decisions too. Can they work here? Can we have a beer with them? Let's see.
I think you have a good point there. We'll talk about that later. But also because the man, and given the Republican who followed him, I now have a lot of respect for George W. Bush that I didn't have then. I think the man has a good heart. He just didn't know anything. I think he was led around by Dick Cheney and got us in a war we had no business being in. And I'm not talking about Afghanistan. I am not a militarist, but I understood that we needed to go in and clean out the Taliban in Afghanistan, not try to stay and make them like us, because that's always a dumb idea. But the decision to invade Iraq, what in the world was that about? We made the Middle East worse probably for decades. But Bush was followed. There were these moments since the 1965 Voting Act when it seemed that democracy in a pluralistic nation would win out. We all know what happened in 2008. The nation elected its first black president. And I want to remind you of what a remarkable multiracial coalition got him there. he didn't get there with black votes because there just aren't enough of us. We represent about 13% of the population. But he won the votes of every ethnic group of color. He won the Latino vote, he won the Asian American vote, he won the Native American vote. It was a remarkable multiracial coalition which included white voters. And so it was a remarkable moment that I thought meant that the nation haltingly, but certainly was marching toward that beloved community that John Lewis and Martin Luther King spoke of.
And then what had happened was, you know, going back to Egerton, right? This would be one of those moments where we could say, okay, there was the kind of promise that he saw, because what was striking to me too about, as an urban sociologist, and this was in Egerton's argument too, that the cities, southern cities, were places where pluralism was, you could see it on display. Even in a place like Memphis, from Memphis is still 65% black, still, you know, sort of black inner city white suburbs, like many places. But even there, you know, so you had all these blue cities that we could see. We'd been seeing them, but you could really see them after the Obama election in 2008 and 2012. And so to get to 2016, I feel like there was a lot of that promise slipping away, kind of this back and forth with politics. And a lot of it was, a lot of the discourse was aimed towards cities as places that needed to be kind of stripped of their power in certain kinds of ways. States' rights not being said, but certainly being enacted, because, you know, we don't have this problem per se in DC. Unfortunately, right?
No.
But in Memphis, right, we're a blue city in a red state, and that is, you know, the case in a lot of places.
Well, before we get to 2016, because I sometimes think that I am, particularly when I'm speaking about the book, I'm a little too pessimistic. So I want to talk about the cities and their pluralism, southern cities, for a moment, because I think it's absolutely true that southern cities are a remarkable example, if we pay attention, to the sort of pluralism that we would wish for nationwide. And it works well. I lived in Atlanta for many years. Lived there, moved, came back, moved again, came back. Because I could live in the South, but not the red South. I happen to love the South, but I love the blue South, not the red South. And Atlanta is one of those cities that after the first black mayor was elected in the 70s, I can't remember quite the year because I wasn't a grown-up journalist yet.
It was either 72 or 76.
Yeah. Somewhere in the 70s, Maynard Jackson was elected mayor, and that just spurred white flight. White people believed, you know, all the things that they had been taught, you know, all their lives, and they rushed out to the suburbs. But then in the 1990s, that began to reverse itself. Whites began to move back into the cities, younger whites, who had grown up with a different perspective. They moved back in. I won't even discuss gentrification since that's a dual-edged sword, but they did move back in. And what I saw in that city was all of these people who accepted the idea of a pluralistic democracy. Gay and straight, white, black, brown, pink and purple, people with all kind of colored hair and hairdos. And you see that even now in Memphis, in Nashville, in Savannah. I taught, when I was teaching at UGA, my favorite student, our relationship developed over my years there, was a young gay white man. He had grown up in some little podunk town with very conservative parents. But after he got to college, his mind was broadened. And he talked to me a lot about his politics and coming out with his parents and grandparents. When he graduated, he went to work for Hillary Clinton's campaign, lived in New York for a time, and called me because he was thinking about going to law school. He said, and I'm thinking about coming back south and I want your advice. I said, come back to Georgia because you can help change the place. So he did. He went to law school at UGA, moved to Savannah, works for a law firm. So that's what you see in the city. Savannah is blue as well. And so the South still holds that example for the rest of the South and the rest of the nation.
And I want to talk about that. I want to jump over 2020 actually to talk about the ways that the South really is kind of doing a lot of leading of the organization against this latest assault on rights, which, you know, the foundation for Supreme Court overreach being kind of echoed here from 2000 to today, thinking about Roe v. Wade. And, you know, Memphis is going to be one of those places. Tennessee is going to be one of those places where you will not be able to get that kind of reproductive health care. And so a clinic there is building a clinic in Carbondale, Illinois. And I was just thinking about all of the organizers across the South who really are in the trenches fighting. They're in cities. They're increasingly even in the smaller towns.
Exactly.
And just, I am beginning to see a different coalition forming. It used to be during Edgerton's time, kind of cities versus rural areas. Now it seems to be kind of cities, small towns in there with it, and then suburbs, which we know are increasingly wealthy and white, even though they are also diverse places. Can you talk about kind of really the subtitle of the book, Democracy in Balance, with where we are right now as we're wrapping up? Because I know people have questions.
Well, I suppose I can't completely leap over 2016 to get to that. I do want you to think about the subtitle of the book, A Story of Democracy in the Balance, because Fry and I very strongly believe that the nation is at an inflection point. I have a friend sitting in the audience who I won't point to, but he said to me last night, I think we're going to see war in this country. I fear that could be true. That is how bad it is at the moment. 2016. So I was in DC covering the Obama administration for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution when the Tea Party formed. They claimed they were all about government spending and taxes. But I attended many of their rallies. I didn't see a single placard or sign about taxes. Not one. I did see a lot of ugly racist stuff. I did see signs that were Obama's face imposed on a witch doctor or on a gorilla. I knew then there was a backlash brewing, that some white Americans were furious over the idea of the election of a black president and frightened by the idea of demographic change. Because what I think this multiracial coalition that elected Obama said to them was, oh my God, white people are no longer going to be in control. And for some whites, a significant minority of whites, that is apparently an extraordinarily frightening prospect. So we had this backlash brewing, which led to the election of Trump. Now, I will tell you that I was still doing television commentary then. Many white pundits wanted to make the election of Trump all about economics, income inequality. I don't doubt that that played some part in Trump's election, but many
Not statistically.
I was about to say, many political scientists have now done studies. I have read their studies, their methodology, the whole thing. I'm sorry, it was about race.
Right, right.
Fast forward to 2020, where Biden wins, but the Trumpists are so furious that they accept Trump's lie that it was all about voter fraud. The other thing they did, their takeaway was, okay, if these folks are going to vote in a way we don't like, we're going to make it much harder for them to vote. And we're going to make it easier for a Republican-controlled state legislature to overturn a fair election if we need to do that in 2024. That's where we are now. But that doesn't even describe all of it. So that's part of it on the political end. What else is happening? I fear that the Buffalo massacre is just the beginning. Somehow we manage not to talk about domestic terrorism very much, but the FBI has been saying since 2016 that it is a bigger threat than foreign terrorism. ISIS is not the biggest threat in this country at the moment. It's people like that young man who have become immersed in this idea of replacement theory. That white people are being replaced. White people who are the real Americans are being replaced by immigrants of color. And so I fear that that sort of violence will only get worse. And I'm going to shut up to see if.
Well, I want to add. Well, let me.
Go ahead.
You can't end like that, Cynthia. Wait a minute now. So I agree that this is an inflection point, a delicate balance. What gives you hope amidst this fear around our democracy here at this moment?
Part of what gives me hope is what you just mentioned. There is a wave of grassroots activism out there that hadn't been seen since the 1960s. It started with the death of George Floyd. And do you know what encouraged me? Not merely that there were people protesting, but they were of every imaginable race and ethnicity out there in the streets. And do you know that protest against police brutality in the summer of 2020 took place on all 7 continents? Every major city around the globe had a protest. And small towns throughout the US, tiny little places, had protests. Excuse me. that was encouraging.
Thank you for that.
Excuse me.
That hope tried to choke you up. Don't let it get you. I get choked up about hope too. I thank you for that, because I think that when I see young people organizing, when I see people saying we won't go back, when I see that there are strategies of resistance all around, I'm like, all right, it's probably going to be a fight, but I'm all right with that, because there are lots of comrades.
Exactly, exactly. There are not just voting rights advocates, but you mentioned the young folk and old folk who are organizing for a post-Roe country.
And have been organizing for one.
Exactly. We know what the Supreme Court is like now. We didn't need the leaked document to tell us what was coming. And I fear there will be many more. I mean, what is to stop them, for example, from deciding that gay marriage was wrongly decided? So I think that there are many organizations and individuals who believe our freedoms are threatened, and they are in the trenches willing to do the hard work to keep this country, keep the guardrails up.
That balance.
This is not about, by the way, liberals winning every election, because that's not going to happen. This is about making sure that every election is fair, that people get to vote, and that the Supreme Court isn't stacked as it is now.
Please, everyone, join me in thanking Cynthia Tucker for being here with us. Thank her for this book. Thank her for this word. And thank you to you and Fry for this.
Thank you.
This is, if you haven't seen the book or gotten the book, what I would say, and this is me speaking as somebody who's taught about these kinds of things for years, I would say this is a beautiful, accessible, very story-driven read about kind of how we got here, beginning with Wallace to the present. And if you're interested in presidential politics, and if you're interested in kind of the pulse of the nation, this book does it. So thank you again.
Thank you.
For
Thank
this. And please give our regards to Fry.
Will do.
Now, questions. We've got Ryan here in the back. He's got the microphone. I was going to say the microwave. Lord, he's got the microphone. I'm hungry. Please, if you have questions, Ryan will bring you the microphone if you have questions for Cynthia.
Or thoughts?
Or thoughts. Don't be scared.
Strategy, and you were trying to work your way through that. I don't know how many people paid attention to in the summer of 2020. Trump went to Wilmington, North Carolina, but his son went to Neshoba.
I did.
Right.
Yes.
How many people paid attention to that? And I'm thinking, what would make a president go to a city of only 187,000 people?
Right.
And how many people besides people who live in North Carolina
Know about Wilmington.
Wilmington, the Wilmington riot.
Right, exactly. So, it was clear to me then, it wasn't about, economics and all the rest of it. It was pretty clear. That's also the city that had the return to the grandfather laws. Wilmington, North Carolina.
And what is interesting to me about that, I can't believe that Trump or his son had read enough to know that.
They did. You know they did. Somebody told
But
them.
somebody told them,
them.
oh, you need to go to Wilmington and you need to send somebody to Neshoba.
And an echo of the Wallace strategy.
Absolutely. Because one of the things that I think that journalists don't pay enough attention to is the symbolism that politicians often use. When Trump went to Wilmington, there were people there who knew all about the history. He didn't have to say it for those people to understand
What was being signified?
what was being signified. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, there's a great section in your book where you're talking about Confederate flag iconography and its function and resurgence. This is something I think about a lot. Memphis had its Nathan Bedford Forrest statue come down recently, and the woman who led the organizing for that is still getting death threats and such. So the symbols really do matter. So going to Wilmington, to Neshoba, there's so many different, it's almost like subtweets of American history.
And I
happening.
will say on both sides of that there is Trump, who became one of the most influential and outspoken defender of Confederate iconography, although he grew up in Queens. But it's also true that in the blue cities of the South, people were coming to their senses. In Memphis, in Richmond, where they have taken down most of the monuments on Monument Boulevard. And I would even give the former Republican governor of South Carolina her props for the move she made before she decided to, become a Trumpist. Nikki Haley gave a very powerful and moving speech after the massacre at Mother Emanuel Church, where she talked about the fact that Dylann Roof had all of these carefully curated photographs of himself on social media, surrounded by the Confederate battle flag and other symbols of the Old South and the Confederacy. And she said, it is time for us to move the rebel flag off the grounds of the South Carolina Capitol. And so, again, the blue cities of the South are still symbols for the rest of the nation if people take that to heart.
Thank you so much for that.
You mentioned George Bush and Barack Obama, so I just want to comment on something that I saw. I lived in Evanston, Illinois, where I saw Barack Obama's political career evolve from state senator, state representative, state senator, all the way to the presidency. And he was not really a black grassroots candidate when he started out his career, because I had a very close white friend, and one day I saw on his lawn Barack Obama's and in Evanston, and I asked him, where did you get this and why did you decide to, I mean, he was pretty much unknown at that time. The white clique in Democratic Party, which is a group name, I mean, both parties have
Right.
Whether they liked it or not. And then now it is the Democrats who are.
Well, there's no doubt about it. I can't remember the name of the candidate, the black candidate he defeated, but yes, I know that history. And that's true for every ambitious politician of every color. You have to be anointed, except for Trump. You know, Trump wasn't anointed. But for the vast majority of ambitious politicians, you have to be anointed by the ruling clique.
Yep.
I also would suggest, because and this is not something that I hold against Obama by any means, but I watched him campaign starting in 2007. And I would see him on television in small groups of white people. And I noticed how comfortable he was. And that's not something you can fake. It's all about body language. And I don't have any doubt that the fact that he was raised by his white grandparents helped him with that. But the reverse is also true. I used to watch Bill Clinton the same way with black people. Very comfortable. Body language a dead giveaway. He could stand up and pray in a black church, have the rhythm right. Not everybody can do that. And it's because as a kid in the little town who can't even remember the name of it, in Arkansas, he grew up in, he was around black people a lot. And so there is something to be said for those people who later become politicians, who have grown up in a biracial or multiracial environment so that they're comfortable. Because as a journalist, that's something I used to watch with both white and black politicians. When you're in a group unlike you, how do you move? Exactly. And again, that's not something you can fake. And I think that helped Obama tremendously in his first campaign.
And it seems too that the king making that happens is all about sort of, and because when we're talking about democracy, we're talking about a center.
Right.
Some kind of center. And the king making is about sort of who is going to kind of move into the center.
Exactly.
And I think what we're seeing now is obviously our center has moved a bit right, a lot right. And what we're seeing is pulls from this kind of organizing in, and we're also seeing pulls from the fascists in, and sometimes it's hard to know what will get sucked up into the center. As you said, Trump was not anointed, and then here we are. Okay, yes, please.
And while she is getting the mic, I will just say this about your comment. I am not entirely sure that the country has moved so much to the right.
Right.
Because when you poll,
We haven't.
Right. When you do a poll, the majority of people still think abortion should be legal in most circumstances. The majority of people still believe that the Dreamers ought to have a path to citizenship. But the Republican Party has moved far to the right.
We have a loud minority instead of a silent majority.
And powerful
a loud
minority.
and powerful minority for sure.
Thanks so much for this. I work in education, so of course I have questions that I know
CRT.
yes, well, kind of. So now we know that today our public schools are even more segregated than they were post, Brown versus Ford. And a lot of people, additionally, potentially white folks, will then just take their kids out of public school and private school. So I would love to know your thoughts on like what role the education system can play in kind of, in this story of yours, and what role it might already be playing. Thank you.
Well, The first thing I would say is pessimistic, that I think is worse than the resegregation. I think, and I did not want to believe this for many years, but I now understand that conservatives are waging a war against public education. And I would hear spokespersons for the teachers' union say that. And where I was at the time living, Georgia doesn't have unions. They have teachers' organizations, but not unions. So I really didn't see that. And then Betsy DeVos was named Secretary of Education. And I began to see it. And I thought, my goodness, and now a few right-wing legislators have said it out loud. They don't want public education. And part of the assault, we think, you know, many educators think charter schools are the assault. That's not really the assault. The assault is these taxpayer-funded voucher programs that will give money to a student can go to any private school with my money, a Catholic school where they denounce abortion, even a SEG Academy can get that voucher money. So my hope is that the activist will start to understand, while resegregation is a problem, the threat is even greater than that. Let's face it, the United States is the country it is because of mandatory public education available to every child. And of course, for those of us who grew up under Jim Crow in the South, it wasn't very good public education for a long time. But let me tell you something, the teachers were good. The buildings were dilapidated, we got the hand-me-down textbooks, but the teachers were good. In fact, public education was subsidized by racism and sexism for a long time, because black people couldn't do anything else and women couldn't do anything else. If we give up on that, if we allow the right-wingers to give up on that, I don't know where we'll be. And I think one of the reasons that they hate public education is because it does broaden minds. You know, the simple fact of the matter is, one of the reasons young people tend to be less racist than my generation, that so many of whom grew up in segregated schools, is they sit next to Korean American kids and black kids and kids with two mommies in class. And they know that's not scary. Nothing bad happens. Well, the right-wingers don't want them to believe that. And so the education isn't just what they learned, the real history they learned. You know, the books that they may read that some folks would like to have banned, it is the actual experience they get of being invited to a birthday party at a home where most of the other kids don't look like them, and it's okay. You know, nothing bad happens. So I think we need, that is the value of public education, and we need to understand, in Alabama, I am busy writing and calling legislatures about this voucher program, saying, I don't want my tax money going to private schools. Are you kidding? Alabama has some of the worst public schools in the country. Every dime of taxpayer money needs to go to public schools. And then if we had another hour, I would tell you about my that I think we ought to have housing vouchers. And that would be the way to resegregate, reintegrate schools.
Thank you so much for that. Please, again, thank you for coming. Please join me in thanking Cynthia for being here. Cynthia Tucker's book is out.
Thank you.
I think, Ryan, do you have an announcement about books?
I do. So the DC Public Library Foundation is giving 30 complimentary books out immediately after this program. If you give us like 3 minutes to set up, we will be able to distribute, and Cynthia will be here to sign it as well.
All
If you
right.
want my scribbling in your book.
Thank you again so
Thank
much. This was
you.
fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you for guiding this conversation.
No, this was